fell out of office. Let's talk to Anthony Albanese about some of these issues. He joins us live from the nation's capital. Thanks for your company.
Good morning, Peter.
All right, let's get into things. I want to start, if I can, with this ABCC changes. Well, I guess both sets of the bills that were the trigger for the election. David Leyonhjelm was telling me a little bit earlier that he doesn't think that the government is as certain to get these things through as they perhaps think that they are. Negotiations are ongoing. We know that Labor opposes it. How much of a blow, though, would it be for Labor, in your view, if the government does get these items through the Senate?
Well, the government, of course, is a bit all over the shop here, Peter. They went to an election saying that they'd present these bills to a joint sitting. Where is it? They didn't talk about these bills during the entire election campaign, and then we've come back, and of course the Senate is more difficult than it was beforehand. The geniuses who went to a double D have recreated, if you like, One Nation, who now have more presence in the federal parliament than they've ever had before, and there's more crossbenchers than there were. So they're finding it difficult to manage. We'll be putting forward our arguments about fairness and about how essentially construction workers shouldn't be treated as criminals for the fact that they happen to work in construction, that the rule of law should apply, that wherever there's any criminal activity, of course, that should be dealt with under the law. But the government really is floundering, looking for an agenda at the same time as they have real economic dark clouds. They have an issue with their AAA credit rating. You had Scott Morrison today disown the fact that they said they'd have a surplus by 2021. You have education funding in a mess with coalition education ministers at the state level slamming the cuts to education. You have ongoing cuts to Medicare, and you have a government that really has lost its way and is struggling to find its feet in this parliament.
If the government's doing so badly, and if Malcolm Turnbull's running such a shambolic government, how can Bill Shorten be 10 points behind on the preferred Prime Minister rating? Is he the right person to take Labor to the next election?
Well, we, of course, are ahead in the two-party preferred count, and that's the key issue. The key issue is our team versus their team, and what people are saying is that our team is the preferred government, and it's been showing that for a while now. And the only team which is talking about leadership issues is, of course, the government side, where Malcolm Turnbull seems to be trying to turn himself into Tony Abbott in order to protect himself from the Abbott forces. And it's no wonder that that's causing disillusionment from people who had a great deal of hope. I think Malcolm Turnbull came to the Prime Ministership with a great deal of goodwill. Australians wanted him to succeed. Now they're wondering what happened to him.
Having said that, though, I mean, is it important on the Labor side that you bill this as a team capable of coming back to government rather than a sort of a man-on-man argument about Prime Ministers? Because, as you say, you know, primary votes up, two-party vote, you're ahead, all the rest of it. But it is an issue. It is an issue. There's obviously some voter doubts there when they compare man-on-man, the two parliamentary leaders.
Well, we are a team led by Bill Shorten, but with an experienced team and a mix of new people coming in. An experienced team in Chris Bowen, a former Treasurer, as the Shadow Treasurer. People like Tony Burke and myself and Catherine King and Jenny Macklin and others who served in government. A Senate leader in Penny Wong, who is an outstanding advocate for her portfolio, but across the parliament, and an intake of the team of 2016 who are incredibly impressive. The 5 new West Australians, for example, who've come in. Tim Hammond's immediately on the front bench, but people like Madeleine King and Josh and Anne and Matt are all really impressive people from Western Australia, where we had a vacant field where no one was recontesting their spot. and other people who've come in as well. I mean, Linda Burney is an outstanding contributor, a former senior minister in the New South Wales government who would be ready to step up in a future federal Labor government as well.
How much will Labor look to change, or should it look to change, in your view, its agenda for the next election? Because obviously you had some pretty significant policies, whether people agreed or disagreed with them, that you took quite boldly, I would argue, into that first attempt at getting back into government after having lost government. Do you stick to your guns and do you look to just sell the same policies, or do you change and change up, and if so, where?
Well, I think they're a starting point. I just addressed an industry group about our changes that we recommended to negative gearing and capital gains tax, and had a discussion with them about those changes, about housing affordability. On infrastructure this morning, I've introduced again into the Parliament a high-speed rail authority bill, an important piece of legislation talking about nation building for Australia. We've seen, I think, on my front of infrastructure, a $3 billion underspend on what the government said it would spend in the last financial year. So at a time where it should be stepping up investment, that's not happening. There's no new public transport investment. The government isn't filling the void. We saw last week a $20 billion injection by the government into the national broadband network. Now, they said it was all fixed. This is on Malcolm Turnbull's watch that this has happened. He was the minister, and the fact is that we're getting a second-rate NBN for higher cost, and with it not fulfilling any of its targets for the rollout. So I think there's a range of measures that Labor got right, but we always reassess those particular policies. We can improve on them, and I think by the time we get to the next election, you'll have a very comprehensive policy plan indeed, right across the spectrum, that reflects our core values of strong economic growth, but inclusive growth, growth that brings the nation with us, with investment, in particular in infrastructure, but also investment in people through education and training. So I think across the board, Labor is in a good position, having done hard policy yards in our first 3 years of opposition, but that policy work is continuing.
Well, on that, can I ask you, I mean, obviously you can't give details, that's not your role to do here, but you are part of Shadow Cabinet. I mean, is this something where you are already, as an opposition, in the throes of putting together some new, you know, signature, if I could put it that way, policies to build off the ones that you took to the last election? Has that process already started?
We're constantly working on policy development, on building on some of the positive things that we did in government, but also the policies that we took to the last election. We're busy holding the government to account, but you've got to have an alternative policy program. And I think one of the problems that the Abbott government have suffered from was that they had a plan to get rid of us, but they didn't have a plan once they actually won the election. So they fell back on ideology in the 2014 budget that really reflected the prejudices that they have against public education, public health, public transport, the public broadcaster. And it became, I think, a government that quickly alienated people who voted for it. And then Malcolm Turnbull had a plan to get rid of Tony Abbott, but he also didn't have a plan to govern. So he's continued a whole range of those policies, which has caused a great deal of frustration out there in the electorate and disappointment, really, in Malcolm Turnbull. They're not angry with him yet, but they are very disappointed, and that disappointment will turn to anger very soon unless we actually see some initiatives, some vision from Malcolm Turnbull, and it's not what we're seeing at the moment.
Well, one of the things that they seem very happy to talk about is keeping the focus on the refugee debate. Peter Dutton indicated here on Sky News yesterday that he'd expect to bring on those legislative changes in the Senate that have passed the House in relation to banning any possibility of asylum seekers on Nauru or Manus from ever coming to Australia. Is Labor absolute in continuing to oppose that if it goes before the Senate?
Well, what's the purpose of it, Peter? They haven't put forward any reason why
They
this
argue,
legislation
far be it from me to put their case,
necessary.
but they argue that without it, and Peter Dutton said this again yesterday, they argue that without it, there is a very real risk that the boats will start up again.
Well, it's just a nonsense. Based upon what? The boats will start up again on the basis, they said, if we settled people on Nauru and Manus in first world countries. That was their argument of months ago. They went through an election campaign where they said they had the policy settings right. And then straight after the election, they say, oh, well, actually, don't believe what we said then. This is the new agenda. I mean, there's got to be a little bit of common sense here. And the idea that people, if they go to the United States, settle, become citizens there, will in 40 years' time, for example, be stopped coming to Australia on a business visa or on a tourist visa is quite frankly quite strange. And a range of things that this government puts forward, they don't back up. What Peter Dutton should have been doing as a minister is finding ways to get people off Manus and Nauru. They now finally acknowledge that that is necessary. These are real people who deserve to be treated in a humane way. You can be tough on people smugglers without being weak on humanity, and that the government needs to recognise that. We're in a bipartisan position on being tough on people smugglers, but it doesn't mean that Labor will just tick off on any absurd proposal, because guess what? They'd come up with something else, I'm sure, if they're looking just for division. One of the things this government needs to do, and I think it's a big problem that they've got, is they look for areas of conflict and division in the local community. And people out there are sick of it. They want a government that gets things done, that unites the country, that moves forward, and that's what they should be doing.
Speaking of having a government that unites a country, just separately away from domestic politics for a moment, how did you feel watching the scenes on that night of the US election, or daytime our time, showing that Donald Trump was soon to be President-elect of the United States?
Well, that, of course, is a decision for the American people. I do note that Hillary Clinton got many more votes, certainly as a minimum of 1 million votes more than Donald Trump in that election, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College, and that has to be respected. That is their system, and I certainly respect that, and Labor and indeed Australia as a country will deal with the United States as our ally. That doesn't mean that immediately you should say that you don't have a view about things that President-elect Trump has said. I think an Australian politician, for example, who mocked a reporter who happened to have a disability in the way in which President-elect Trump did, would have had great difficulty, I think, proceeding through an election campaign. So I think one of the things that it does for me is it shows, if I look at the US election...
I just need to jump in there, Anthony Albanese. My apologies to you. Rod Cullerton has just commenced a media conference. We'll come back to you. Let's just have a listen into what he's got to say. He's outside the High Court.
The judge, well, that's like, in a sense, arguing about something that never ever happened. So it's up for Brandis's lawyers now to come forward and prove their case. So other than that, it went well. The court ordered that Brandis's lawyers help construct my case, as I'm a self-litigant, but I expressed to the court that would be like sleeping with the enemy. We'll run our case the best way we feel it can be run, and that will be waiting for their further submissions on how they're going to argue the case of annulment, because, you know, I think that's a bit long bowed. I don't think that'll go anywhere. So.
All right, that's Rod Culleton there responding to some of the proceedings ahead of or during his High Court hearing there. More details, of course, will emerge as we get to the fundamentals of that case. But that's the quote, isn't it? It went well. That's his view. It went well. What a schmozzle the whole thing is, but it went well as far as Rod Culleton is concerned. Let's bring back Anthony Albanese. Sorry for the interruption there. We were talking US.
That's okay.
You never want to miss a Rod Culleton media conference, Anthony Albanese. After having seen the last one, that is not one that you want to miss if you can avoid it. Let me ask your views before we run out of time. Let me get to some other issues with you. I want to get back to this story that's in both the Financial Review as well as the Australian today. The AAA credit rating at risk because of low wages growth as well as low profits. Is that really the time not to try to find ways to spur on economic growth? That's what the government would say.
It, of course, is the time to spur on economic growth, but it's also not the time to continue to attack the trade union movement. And that's what this government is obsessed about. We have real living standards have fallen by 2% in the recent period. And that's having an impact on household budgets, which means that people can't spend as much, which means they're not creating as many jobs. At the same time, the government, when you say, as they did in their 2014 budget, we're cutting pensions, education, health, but we're going to invest in infrastructure, but you underspend by $3 billion in 2015-16 on what you said you would do, then that has an impact in terms of contraction of the economy, not just in the short term, but in the long term, because you don't have that productivity-boosting infrastructure. And that's why the government has got it wrong in terms of a failure to invest, particularly at a time when the Reserve Bank governors, both past and present, have warned, Mr Lowe and Mr Stevens have warned that monetary policy can't do all the heavy lifting in terms of economic stimulus. That investing in infrastructure, there's no better time because of the level of interest rates to do now, given that as well the context of the mining boom moving from the investment phase to the production phase means that there's a drop-off in infrastructure investment associated with that. So the government should be stepping up, and they're not doing it. They should be building a railway line in terms of the new airport at Badger East Creek. They should be building the Cross River Rail. They should be investing in Melbourne Metro in Victoria. They should be investing in the Metronet in Perth. They should be investing in Adelink Light Rail in Adelaide. They should be doing these things, but they're not doing it. They have a slogan of jobs and growth, but nothing beneath it, no strategy to get there.
One final question, if I can, before I let you go, Anthony Albanese. I mean, in your space of infrastructure, you've been talking about it there. The government claims, and they've done it since the Abbott era, if I could put it that way, that, you know, they're sort of an infrastructure spending government. They're using it to drive growth. Senator Zed Zelja did it a little earlier on this program. Where is the divide between Labor's criticism of the government in this key portfolio area, your portfolio area, versus what they say? I mean, how different is it what they're doing from what Labor argued for, and how different is the quantum of spending that, in your opinion, renders their claims false?
Well, you just have to look at their own budget figures. Actual investment as opposed to proposed investment. The budget figures for actual investment in 2015-16 show $5.5 billion rather than $8 billion, and that includes $490 million as a one-off payment to WA for GST compensation. So a $3 billion underspend. Underspends on the Pacific Highway, the Bruce Highway, a whole range of projects that they said they would do that simply haven't got done. And that follows a $1 billion underspend on the previous year. So it's not surprising when you stop projects that were ready to go, like Melbourne Metro, the M80 in Melbourne, the Cross River Rail project in Brisbane, and come up with thought bubbles for projects that aren't ready to go or that don't stack up, like Perth Freight Link, then you have a gap And that's what we're seeing, a gap. There was a 20% decline in public sector infrastructure investment in its first 2 years of office. And not in a single quarter since they came to office have they matched the infrastructure investment that was there in our last quarter of September 2013. So they simply aren't investing. And in the NBN, of course, it is just disastrous to have this $20 billion additional funding be required from the government to NBN in order to produce what is a second-rate NBN, where they used money, of course, to purchase copper wire. Literally enough copper wire to go from here to Japan at a time when everyone knows that the future is fibre, not copper, and they just haven't got the infrastructure agenda right, and it's one of the big failings of this government.
Anthony Albanese, always appreciate you joining us. Thanks for being on To The Point today. Cheers.
Good to be with you.